So, I noticed among the World of Warcraft community, there are quite a few arguments which inevitably devolve into a series of shit-flinging and shouting that never get resolved. Things like, is Sylvanas morally grey or just evil? Are casuals ruining the game or are elitists ruining the game? Is PvP a useless minigame or is PvE a very easy minigame? Are traps gay? All these debates are generally very inflammatory in origin, but none of them can measure up to the ultimate question, which is melee DPS versus range DPS. Do melee DPS get it easier? Do range DPS get it easier? Are range DPS favored in raids over melee DPS, or is it just an urban legend? What about Mythic Plus? Is melee DPS getting favored over range DPS, or is it also a fake news? So, to facilitate the shit-flinging about this argument, I'm gonna come in today with some facts and logic to debunk all the fakes with numbers, data, and proof. So, starting to talk about this, you have to point out that the main difference between ranged and melee, of course, isn't the damage. Long are the days where Blizzard, for example, was considering things like the hybrid DPS stacks, where you can do other things other than DPSing, so you shouldn't be doing as much DPS as a pure DPS class. There are more pressing matters like positioning. Because bosses have mechanics, because some mechanics would be really weird, if not completely impossible to deal with, if they targeted anyone in the raid, they had to split them. Some of them are hitting melee, some of them are hitting ranged, some of them are not even hitting healers at all, or tanks, for example. And because of this, the general idea became that being a ranged DPS in raids was preferred over being a melee DPS, because it's easier to deal with mechanics, because the way Blizzard gives you mechanics, things like stack, things like spread, are easier to accomplish in range, away from the boss, particularly things like spreading. Melee DPS have quite some problems because they can only normally spread as wide as the boss's hitbox. As well as all of the series of mechanics which force you to run away from the boss, or run away to hide somewhere, to step on something, and if you are a ranged DPS you have an advantage. So this was the idea when it came to raids. When it came to Mythic Plus, it was sort of the opposite. Because Mythic Plus is essentially a continuous boss battle, where most of the mobs you will be facing are going to be susceptible by your CC, your crowd control, melee DPS have been given by Blizzard as a design choice a heavier crowd control kit. Because they have to actually face the mobs firsthand, they usually have more stuns. They have more ways to apply crowd controls, hard crowd control, as well as a shorter interrupt. For example, range DPS usually are more loaded in things like snares, in things like roots, in things like slows and knockbacks, because of course they are range DPS. They don't want to stay close to the mob, they want to keep it away, whereas the melee just want to stun him as they damage him. All of this becomes more prevalent and more useful in Mythic Plus, particularly the shorter interrupt, making melee DPS more useful in Mythic Plus. This was the original idea. Range DPS were getting favored in raids, and melee DPS were getting favored in Mythic Plus. So, how true is this? Let's look at the numbers. Let's refresh your memory of the last expansion that just ended, just to give you a point to start from before we look at this expansion. Starting from the Battle of the Tarlor for raids and Season 2 for Mythic Plus, it was actually rather even, because in BOD, 314,000 range DPS were logged in the first part of Mythic Progression, versus 240,000 melee DPS. This is a 56-44, so it's kind of okay. I would say balanced. When you look at Mythic Plus, you had 1.5 million logged ranged and 640,000 melee DPS. So a slight 52-53% advantage for melee in Mythic Plus. You go higher, you go into Season 3, which is the Eternal Palace, and raid remains the same. 170,000 for range DPS versus 138,000 for melee. Again, 55-45 split. So it is staying more or less close, more or less even. Mythic Plus follows the same route. 1.3 million logs for range DPS versus 1.5 for melee DPS. So again, a slight advantage in favor of melee in Mythic Plus. So it seems like this theory is keeping up. Melee has an advantage in Mythic Plus and ranged have an advantage in raids. Now, the last tier could have been the more shaky because Nyalota had the corruptions, tons of unbalancedness going around with all the scaling that was happening back then, which made raid DPS get a 57% representation in raids compared to the 43% of melee. This is both before the round of nerfs to corruptions and the round of balance tuning, and after. Before it was a 57k, 43k split, and after it was a 337 versus 255. The percentages remained basically the same. In Mythic Plus though, melee DPS answered the same way. Okay, you're scaling better in raids, you're getting more prominent in raids, my dear ranged. We are gonna do the same in Mythic Plus. 1.7 million versus 1.3 million in Season 4 of BFA. So 57% favor of melee in Mythic Plus versus 43% of ranged, and then 57% representation of ranged in raids versus 43% of melee. So perfect balance was achieved. Not exactly perfect, but at least the two types of damage dealers were splitting the content for themselves. So when we go and look at current season, current year, Shadowlands. Season 1, we have the Prideful Affix and we have Castonatria. In Castonatria, right now, and this is the reason why I am making the video. Because as of right now, we have 162,000 range DPS logs and 89,000 melee DPS logs. Quick maths, that is a 64.5% range representation versus 35.5% melee representation. This is the lowest representation of melee DPS in recent years in raid so far. When we look at Mythic Plus, again, we have so far the entirety of the logs of Mythic Plus. This expansion is 1,147,000 for ranged and 970,000 for melee. So we have an advantage of ranged over melee in Mythic Plus for the first time as well. What becomes even worse is that when you look at the high keys, so 10 plus keys, at least keys high enough to have the seasonal affix, relevant enough to the current meta, you have 323,000 ranged versus 244,000 melee, which is a 57% advantage for ranged in Mythic Plus. This was the advantage that melee has had and kept for the past 3 seasons of Mythic Plus in BFA. They went from 57 from 43, a net loss of 14%. What actually also gives you a better insight on the fact that range DPS are basically taking over melee where melee is getting benched is that at lower keys, ranged is at 52, and in higher keys, they go up to 57. When you look at heroic raiding, where basically everyone is allowed, there is no limit of 20 players and everyone can get in, you have 2.5 million logs for ranged and 1.7 for melee, which is a 59-41 split. So from heroic to mythic, melee go from 41 to 35. And from normal lower keys to higher keys, melees go from 48 to 43. So they are being essentially decimated in both contents. That is the reason why this video exists, because currently melees aren't popular anywhere. Now, we can make some excuses, okay? We can make the excuse that, yes, in BFA, melee was more popular than range DPS in Mythic Plus, but we also have to say that we are talking about Rogue and Havoc. I don't want to make my other melee bros feel bad when I mention the melee dominance in Mythic Plus in BFA when they were playing Retribution, Arms, Fury, Enhancement, Feral, Frost DK, Unholy DK. Those specs weren't popular at all. So when I'm talking about melee, I'm talking more or less just about Outlaw and Havoc most of the time. So yes, it's a little bit disingenuous to mention melee when I'm talking about popularity, but still. At the very least, melee had chances to re-roll to a spec that was melee and was popular. Now, it's basically just Unholy and the usual Rogue. But not even that is enough, because Marksmanship, because Fire, even now Affliction and Balanced Druid are just becoming more and more popular. And in Raids, it's not looking better either. Raids is basically the worst type of balance split that you have had in the recent tiers, at least as far as sites like Warcraft Logs or Raider.io can keep track of. It's basically the worst state. And what's even worse is that bosses that don't even have enough logs yet to make this weigh quite a bit, like Sludgefist, are even more melee unfriendly. Just to give you an idea, to you people who haven't gotten to Sludgefist, or to you people who don't raid, as of right now, the entirety of the melee DPS logged for Sludge Fist are lower than the fourth more popular range spec. There are more balanced players logged on Mythic Sludge Fist than the entirety of the melee DPS, for example. And in other bosses, it doesn't get that much better either, because you have the entirety of the melee DPS logged in for Council of Blood, for example, which are lower than just Unholy. So you have three roles in raids, which is melee DPS, range DPS, and Unholy DPS. So the representation is going basically even worse than last expansion for melee. The only saving grace, you could say, is that when it comes to Mythic Plus representation, they are actually more diverse than before. This is the current 15 and up representation. Even if, not many of you have started doing 15 and up, we can look at 10 and up, where more of you have probably gotten to doing 10 keys. You can see that, Warrior is more than 1 out of 10 DPSers, 1 out of 10 melee DPSers, out of 13 specs, Ret, 1 out of 10, Windwalker, 1 out of 10, Havoc, 1 out of 10, 2 different rogue specs, sure, and then Unholy. So you do have a much better and much smoother representation. However, it is getting squished by range DPS. This is probably going to be a mix of, I guess, bad luck and bad design. The bad luck part comes from the flavor of the month problem, right? Flavor of the month is not something that Blizzard is going to plan ahead of time. For all we know, this tier, instead of having marksmanship, fire, and balanced druid be flavor of the month with just Unholy as the melee spec, we could have gotten Unholy, Subtlety, and Fury Warrior, and marksmanship and balance just being mediocre. So if that were the case, would we still have seen so many range DPS over melee DPS? Probably not. And then there is the bad design part, which is obviously boss design and even Mythic Plus design, although Mythic Plus is not likely as bad as raids. As long as we continue having plenty of mechanics where melee DPS lose tons of uptime on the boss, for example, Hungering Destroyer, where you have to constantly spread out to drop the spheres or constantly run away for consume, which doesn't allow you to DPS as a melee, but does allow you to DPS as a ranged, it's just going to passively make ranged better. Then you have fights like, of course, Sludge Fist, which is a nightmare for melee DPS, to not kill yourselves, literally. So I'm not exactly sure what the solution about the design part is, because I'm not a designer myself. And well, of course, the solution to the flavor of the monthness problem was simply to keep the specs balanced. Duh, that's pretty obvious. Unfortunately, it didn't happen, so it just so happened that 5 out of the 6 best performing, highest simming, strongest theoretical specs were all range DPS. So when that happens, it's also hard to justify melee DPS not being overshadowed by the situation. So I hope you enjoyed this numbers rundown between melee DPS and range DPS. The official answer for Season 1 of Shadowlands is that range DPS is favored. As a matter of fact, it is more favored than, at the very least, the last 2 years, minimum, with a particular eye to be set on raids, where the difference has gotten even bigger, even wider, and more problematic and preoccupying than before. So I'll leave you with what is going to be, I'm sure, a set of civil comments about this discussion. See you guys soon. In the meantime, range DPS, melee DPS, or unholy DPS?